Welcome to the BriteVibe podcast. At BriteVibe, we believe everyone deserves to be happy. But in today's world, everywhere you turn, there is division and negativity. At BriteVibe, we have created a global movement to bring 8 million people together who are inspired to live bright, live bold, and share bright vibes. Alone, it can be hard to change, but together we can change the world. Welcome to the BriteVibe podcast.
Well, Nick Jonsson, welcome to the BriteVibe podcast. So happy to have you on today.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Yeah. So your background, you have a book called Executive Loneliness, and we're going to dive into that today. You also run kind of an executive network, a network for executives to support them and help them. But what's kind of your background, your professional background? What kind of brought you into this space?
Well, I worked in PR, marketing, and advertising, and worked up my career that way. But then eventually I became a general manager, managing director. And then I was heading up actually a fashion company at one stage in Southeast Asia. Mm-hmm. And then I was also managing in the medical industry, eventually managing hospitals and clinics again as a general manager. So that's the career path, running and leading teams basically.
Okay. And then, so in your book, it talks about executive loneliness, but really this was your own path, right? You were an executive, you experienced the things that we're going to visit about today, which today on the show, we're going to talk about depression. We're going to talk about suicide. We're going to talk about isolation. We're going to talk about, you have a very unique perspective in that you talk to leaders daily of companies. And when we say leaders, obviously you're talking to usually the CEO or the owner of a business, but this really applies to anybody. I feel like this depression, isolation, loneliness really applies to anybody especially in business, but anybody really in the world, right? This is a weird time that's almost, I have a lot of guests on the show. It's like a pandemic, like loneliness, depression, and isolation's like a global pandemic that we're experiencing right now. And I've lived 50 some years on this earth. I don't remember ever actually feeling this lonely. And as we dive into your story today, I have a lot of, there's a lot of similarities between my story and your story as far as shared life experience is what I'll call it, right? There's some things in there. So you were a high functioning executive, you were running hospital systems, you run marketing companies, you run all these companies, but what were you experiencing?
Well, looking back at my career, I realized, Matt, that it was quite a lonely affair. And I think it's because the way the world is set up, already at university, we are encouraged to study hard, to get scholarships, to get awards for topping the classes and so on. And winning became addicted to me. I really wanted to do well at university. I enjoyed going to those award nights and, getting the trophies and so on. And that was my game. And then when I came into the workforce, I thought it was the same. I wanted to get the promotion. I was so hungry to get, the higher titles. And I only wanted to become managing director. There was nowhere else I wanted to go inside the organization, to the point where actually one of my jobs, believe it or not, but I was actually hired as a future managing director. That was what they were announcing for. And I applied for that. And out of 3,000 people, a few of us got that kind of role. So it's hungry for success.
Yeah. And I think you're describing a very typical, especially for men. But I know a lot of women are driven that way too, right? And it's a very, that's a societal thing that I think especially people around our age grew up with this, I've got some friends that call it the Mercedes 80s, right? So if you were growing up at any point in your adolescence or young or adolescence in the 80s, you were, the Gordon Gekko mentality. It was like you were supposed to, go to college, get a degree, get out, be driven, go to the top so that you could have the nice house and the nice cars and all this stuff. I'll let you tell the story, but where did it lead you? Right?
Yeah. So having that mentality in the workplace, if you work much harder than everyone else and you're putting in the effort, so when people go home and maybe have some fun with the family, and if you continue to work, or all you do is socialize or network and do everything to get your career forward and educate yourself, then most likely that's what you're going to get. But that many times also unfortunately means that you have to step on toes of other people and colleagues, and it's quite selfish. And that is what I didn't realize. And once I found myself at the top, I wasn't happy. I wasn't happy. And then you're wondering, I gone through all this work over all these years. Now I am where I want to be. Now what? And and that's really what puzzled me and it really made me insecure. To add to that, I was also twice laid off from senior positions. Once because of a conflict, the second time because of merger and acquisition. And then you also wonder, okay, I put in again all this work. I really loved my job, and suddenly you laid off from these roles, and then you have to start all over again. And that was not something that I was mentally prepared for.
Mm-hmm. And so when you say you weren't mentally prepared, so I guess how did that show up? How did that manifest, not being mentally prepared for that?
Well, I think in my case, and I know for many others also, is that we sort of define ourselves in the job. We have the business card and all the perks that comes with that. And once that's taken away from you, again, you sort of lose a part of your identity. And linking back to what I just described before, perhaps many of us are what I talk about, anxious overachievers, and so we're working so hard to get this and to fill some gap inside us. And when that gap is met, then we're not happy there either. But then if it's pulled away from us, then, we get completely lost. And that's what happened to me. I didn't know how to explain it to anyone in my surrounding once I was laid off. I had no words.
Mm-hmm. So let's get into because, we've been talking about kind of the darker side of the experience, but then in your book, Executive Loneliness, what are some of the things that you outline to help us not carry the burden ourselves, I guess? What are some of the things you share?
Yeah, happy to talk you through them. And let me share why I also can do that. Because as I then gave my talk also, because people heard me on radio, they called me and said, can you come and talk to us about this? And the Women Association in Singapore wanted me to come and give a talk. And then it was all the chambers of commerce. I think I spoke to almost all the chambers of commerce around and gave my talk. And everyone had the same question after my talk. Well, that's great for you. You had an alcohol problem, and that's where you really got the best help in the year. What do I do if I'm not an alcoholic? Where should I get my help? And as I had that question the whole time, I didn't want to tell people to go out and drink until you have a problem so you can go in and get that beautiful support.
Right.
So that's why I thought I better. So that's when I started to analyze, what would be the steps? What are the steps I've taken here to really, get well? And removing the alcohol part, which not everyone has an issue with. And that's what I wrote in my book. And I wrote the 5 steps. So most recovery program have 12 steps, but the summary that I wrote was the 5 steps there. And I'm happy to Matt, to just talk you briefly through them.
Yeah, let's go through them.
Yeah, so the first one, and this can be a shock for people if they haven't done it before. The first one was taking stock. Mm-hmm. And if you think about a business owner, or if you have a shop, you'll do an audit, a stock take once a month or a quarter, at least once a year to know what's there. But how often do we do an honest audit of ourselves? How often do we get out a pen and paper or a spreadsheet and write everything down? I'm overweight, I have an alcohol problem, I have some broken relationships, and list them. And in my case, I had not spoken with my sister for a while. I had something going on with the neighbors, and I had resigned from some jobs. It was unsaid things, and there was all these things that was giving me pain and inside me, and I had to write that down. And I did that then with a sponsor, but you can do it with a coach or a mentor or a friend, and just get everything down on paper.
Mm-hmm. And so really kind of being real with I kind of, when I was writing my notes, the things left undone, kind of like what the relation, I'm assuming that the relationships were probably the most painful part of that, because that's where it's usually the most painful, right? Especially unspoken or I've got some of those, as you were speaking, I was like, yeah, I've got a couple of things that I probably should address in that area that I haven't, that I've just let set there. Right. So
yeah. And I say in my book also, you're only as sick as your secret. So it's about getting all these things down there. And the first step is doing nothing about it, just writing it all down. And
right.
This can take a week or a few weeks and I was encouraged even to think through all the way from young childhood. I dug out, old school photos, looking at the picture of everyone, finding the name list, thinking, Had I said something to someone who had hurt them? Was it something that was I bullied? Had I bullied someone? And really, so it's a proper inventory. And I wrote about 80, 90 things on this list. I've heard others have written up to 400 items.
Wow. So this isn't a couple things that you write down that you think about that have happened in the last year. This is like an inventory of the relationships you've had in your life.
Yes, not only relationships, also the issues you have. If you have a credit card debt and you have issues with whatever there are, everything basically that can give you a harm or give you an issue or should be written down here in the first step. And then as we move over to the second step, then is add another column on the paper or in the spreadsheet and start writing, who can I talk to this about, asking for help here. And that was just without starting to do that, but just writing it all down there.
Okay. And so that's kind of who can help you navigate this, or who can help you
exactly
understand or even work through, just like you're doing with me, kind of thinking about the deeper levels of, and it really sounds like it's like anything at all that's causing any type of internal conflict, you want to write it down, right? Anything you feel guilty about, anything you feel shameful about, anything that you would not want to tell somebody else, this is what you're writing down.
Exactly. And as you can imagine, for any 12-step program, may it be for gambling addiction, social media addiction, drugs or alcohol or whatever the addiction is, you need to remove that because those are the triggers. So that was what I learned, and I thought I worked with coaches, I've gone through so many trainings and never have I been told to do this. And there's so many people who have sugar addictions who go and grab food and they suddenly gain weight. They're not happy about it, but it's all these triggers. So it works for any addiction or any problems and any issues.
Because the triggers, the trigger, but then whatever you're doing to coat the pain is not going to go away as long as the underlying trigger, the underlying pain is not being addressed. There's always going to be something else, right? Where do people find out more about your work? They go to a website, you follow you on LinkedIn, obviously, but what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, so I'm active on LinkedIn, so they can look up Nick Jonsson on LinkedIn, and that's NickJonsson. Otherwise, if they're interested in my book, it's on Amazon, both as a Kindle book, hardcover, and also on Audible if they prefer audiobook, and it's called Executive Loneliness.
And then as we wind up our time here today, kind of what would be, I love asking this question at the end of the podcast, just to bring kind of succinctness and clarity to, but what would be something that you do want every single person on the face of the earth, right? 8 billion people. If we, capture this next couple, minute or two, and we were able to broadcast this worldwide, what would be the one message that you would think would have, what would have the highest impact and the most resonance with people worldwide?
Well, I think if everyone could write down the most painful thing that they have on their mind, and also ask that, talk to one person about that.
Just to let that.
The most painful thing, and just talk to someone within that day, then a lot of things will be solved. A lot of pain will be lifted.
Oh, love it. Love it. Simple and highly impactful. Well, Nick, thank you so much for coming on the BriteVibe podcast today. I certainly appreciate it. And I'm sure our listeners will appreciate it as well. And, you're now a friend of the show. So anytime you'd like to come back on and visit about, new iterations of what you're doing, or if you have a new book or speaking somewhere, we'd love to have you come back on and visit anytime.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Matt. And thanks to the listeners as well.